So you've already read Act 2, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure and are desperate to acquire an even more detailed insight into this crucial scene? Well, you're in the right place. Stay tuned. This is Schofield on Shakespeare.
Simili a degli eroi, abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
This is one of the most famous and most powerful scenes in the play. It starts with the provost listening to his conscience by checking with Angelo that he really does want Claudio to be executed the following morning. Angelo is resolute. A cautious and relatively diplomatic Aeschylus was not able to dissuade him in the previous scene, and the provost is similarly unsuccessful, with Angelo coming across as particularly brusque and dismissive, even suggesting that he would not be missed were he to decide to step down from his role. Perhaps the last-ditch plea for mercy is triggered in part by the fact that Claudio's loved one, Juliet, is shortly about to give birth. But will the new child come into the world with his or her father having been freshly executed? Typically, Angelo refuses to engage with the situation on a personal level, caustically referring to her as fornicatress. Next up, Isabella enters with sidekick Lucio, ready to give her a metaphorical prod in the ribs every now and again. She starts her pleas on behalf of her brother by stressing, perhaps truthfully, but not particularly helpfully, how much she detests the vice she has to advocate for. She is in a very tricky situation, she affirms. Following this inauspicious start, she asks for Claudio to be saved, using the spectacularly unconvincing argument that his vice should be condemned rather than himself. Angelo has no trouble at all pouring scorn upon this possibility, pointing out that by definition, sins and vices are condemned even before they have been committed. If he were to do as she suggests, he would be removing all point and function from his role as a law enforcer. Isabella, perhaps nervous in front of this great man and more used to the company of the likes of Francisca from Act 1, Scene 4, immediately gives in, only for Lucio to prod her back to have another go. Her efforts so far have been so lackluster that it's almost as though she has been asking for an utterly commonplace tiny domestic item such as a pin. So Isabella returns to Angelo and begins to demonstrate some of that prosperous art and ability to play with reason and discourse which Claudio referenced in Act 1, Scene 2. She suggests that no one will mind or get upset about the sentence being reversed, that the greatest recognise the value of mercy, and that if the roles were switched between Claudio and Angelo, her brother would have been far more forgiving. Angelo doesn't seem to respond or listen a great deal to these arguments, although this, of course, will depend on the production. His responses are curt and matter of fact. Claudio has broken the law and needs to be punished. Isabella then shifts to argument even more explicitly inspired by her own Christian beliefs. She points out that human beings are intrinsically sinful, following the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Yet through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, all believers can still potentially be forgiven by God and received into his arms. Angelo remains resolute, once again removing himself from the process. He has no power himself. The law is the demigod which needs to be followed. Isabella then tries a different tack. Killing Claudio so rapidly is effectively giving him worse treatment than chickens and turkeys, which are only killed during certain periods of the year. She also points out what has become bleedingly obvious, that the vast majority of Vienna is at it, i.e. indulging in extramarital sex, yet they haven't been sentenced to death. Angelo is then prompted to give some decent arguments of his own. He has not whimsically come up with this law on fornication. It has always been there. It's just that it hasn't been enforced properly. By enforcing it now, he will prevent future Claudios from doing the same thing. Implicitly, this sentencing will begin to clean up the cesspit that is currently Vienna. Isabella then moves up a gear and hammers the generic concept of those that have great authority electing to unnecessarily bludgeon. God doesn't. Why, therefore, should those that get some power feel the need to disproportionately punish? And from generic, she moves to the personal. Has Angelo himself ever felt similar urges that led Claudio to indulge in a lust-fueled liaison with Juliet? If he has, then he should spare the doomed one. In delicious asides to the audience, Angelo reveals that a crack has appeared in his apparently invincible exterior. Most intriguingly, he has found himself turned on by Isabella and her pleadings. And when Isabella chooses a most unfortunate verb, when suggesting that she will come back tomorrow to persuade him further, bribe, he confirms to a delighted audience that this meeting has affected him in a way he would never have envisaged. He is honest enough to admit that Isabella had no intention or thoughts of attracting him in a sexual way, and he worries about what these sexual desires reveal about his own character and person. After all, he would never have found himself stirring if a determined prostitute had set out to charm him. Oh no. Here are a couple of splendid questions for you to consider. I would recommend pausing the video in a moment to write some detailed paragraphs of your own before continuing the video to consider my ideas. So grab your pen, press pause. The video will resume in 5 seconds time. Question 1. Self-righteous cant. To what extent do you agree with this interpretation of Angelo's behaviour in this scene? I wonder how many of you initially misread the word cant and nodded in agreement, thinking, yes, that sounds about right. But this question wants you to consider the sincerity of Angelo's statements about justice and the law in this scene. Should these statements be dismissed as Angelo simply lauding his own moral superiority, rather than being of implicit value and worth in themselves, particularly in the light of his seemingly hypocritical revelations at the end of the scene? Is there any possibility that we might want to give Angelo credit for his steadfastness and determination to uphold what he sees as the law? I didn't come up with this memorable phrase myself, I must confess. It was taken from a JSTOR essay entitled Public Justice and Private Mercy in Measure for Measure. Do press pause to read this now in full if you would like to do so. However, essentially, Stacy Magadance is pointing out that Angelo is simply following the principles of law which we continue to follow today. Laws have to be enforced impersonally to reduce the potential for corruption and unfairness. And so it is a good thing that Angelo refuses to get emotionally involved with Claudio's plight. Magadance also points out that Angelo is doing exactly what the Duke wished him to do, to restore order within dissolute Vienna. So these are the general principles. Let's look more closely at Angelo's language. His initial rhetorical question here is disbelieving. He can't quite believe that Isabella has suggested that condemning sex outside marriage, but not condemning those that have sex outside marriage, can be any kind of viable possibility. He points out that such an approach would leave him completely redundant and worthless. He would become an empty shell, the very cipher of a function, and thus be ignoring the Duke's instructions to enforce or qualify the laws as to his soul seems good. This doesn't seem self-righteous cant so far, just perfectly reasonable. It also strikes me that Angelo seems pretty busy. At the beginning of the scene, a servant tells the provost that he's hearing of the cause, he's hearing the details of another case. Whilst the fact Act 2 Scene 1 starts mid-discussion may also imply that he may not have managed to have any non-work related time at all since taking on his new responsibilities. When talking about Juliet, yes, he is abrupt, as seen in his use of the scarily dismissive imperative verb dispose. And yes, the term fornicatress does seem oppressively and unnecessarily judgmental, particularly for a modern palate. Nonetheless, the question we have to ask ourselves is this, and it is a very modern one. Do we want our law enforcers to be touchy-feely, garrulous, and in touch with their feelings? Or do we want them to briskly get through as much work as possible and dispassionately and efficiently enforce the law, as Angelo seems to be doing for the majority of this scene? Another definition of cant suggests that it consists of the repetition of conventional or trite opinions or feelings, or just stock phrases wheeled out unimaginatively, irrespective of appropriateness. Are the lines now on screen really just tired, learnt and insincere, or are there signs of genuine passion and belief from Angelo in what he is doing? The personification of the law implies genuine, deep-rooted respect for it as a crucial means of governance. Whilst the reference to Claudio's crime as that evil seems genuine, he feels that what Claudio has done is deeply wrong, and the prevalence of extramarital sex is having a deeply malign effect on the city as a whole. But it is the simile comparing the law to a prophet which seems particularly magnificent to me, and suggests that at this point in the play, Angelo does believe wholeheartedly in what he is doing and saying. His imagery has the personified figure of the law peering into a magic ball, which has the power to show the future. Something that Macbeth actually sees following his foolish final visit to the witches. Failure to act now from Angelo will result in future acts of illegal sex, some of them even given the idea after noting that previous offenders have got away scot-free. Without his action, the magic ball shows those sinful acts of premarital sex as figuratively waiting to be hatched, to come out of their eggs. But with this decision to sentence Claudio, they will not hatch, nor even come to full life. Thus Vienna will be able to breathe again, following a return to decency and moral order. Whether or not you agree with Angelo's viewpoints, or even dislike his moral standpoints, to describe his statements as cant at this stage in the play seems inaccurate and unfair. Evangelical passion oozes from his imagery. He has a job, he has a vision, and he is going to enforce this because it is the right thing to do. The extent to which audiences will agree with this will depend to some extent on the production. Just how depraved and pervy do Lucio and the other men appear in Act 1, Scene 2? What is going on in the background? In my video on Act 1, Scene 2, I referenced David Thacker's 1994 TV version of the play, and this moment in which a woman is vomiting at the very front, whilst at the back another woman is stripping. Doesn't this world need an Angelo who, angel-like, is going to swoop on the grubby, grimy shaggers and mercilessly enforce the law? Or do we listen to Lucio, Pompey and others in Act 1, Scene 2 and simply smile at their sexualised banter as an inevitable part of the natural world? Our own opinions and prejudices and past experience are therefore likely to influence the way we react to Angelo in this scene. That said, we cannot neglect Angelo's soliloquy at the end of the scene when considering the question, which shows that over the course of their meeting, he has become desperately sexually attracted to Isabella. This forces us to reconsider his past speeches. Was he simply playing the role of city moral guardian, and is he actually a shameless hypocrite? For me, the bewildered, self-questioning nature of the lines on screen now imply that Angelo was being genuine when explaining his reasoning for Claudio's sentencing. The repetition of "what's this?" sounds frantic, as though Angelo is forcing himself to come to terms with the sudden awakening of his own feelings of lust. The use of the noun fault suggests that he feels something bad has just occurred to him, for which someone needs to be blamed, which is consistent with his previous stance on the evils of fornication and lustful desires. Meanwhile, his imagery, which likens his actions to that of dead, stinking flesh, suggests that Angelo is genuinely appalled by the rise of these desires within him. Something seen again in another powerful piece of imagery shown on screen now. The sufficiency of waste ground presumably refers to the number of dissolute establishments or brothels already available for customers within Vienna. Meanwhile, the main clause shows Angelo's disbelief and outrage at his own newly acquired desire to seduce and corrupt someone who comes from a very different place, a holy establishment such as a nunnery. Raise is a particularly powerful verb, suggesting complete obliteration and destruction. Also used by an increasingly deranged Macbeth, giving instructions to a doctor, desperate to restore his wife to sanity. Angelo feels that acting upon his lustful desires towards Isabella will utterly destroy her, spiritually and physically, and he can't believe that these feelings have appeared out of nowhere within him. Hence the disgusted cries of "Fie, fie, fie." So to return to the question, I would argue that in this scene, Angelo does seem a little self-righteous, but he does not come out with cant. He believes wholeheartedly in the law and the evil of lustful desires. And when he himself comes down with the plague, you see a man utterly bewildered and self-loathing. For perhaps the first time in his life, he is going to experience what it means to be truly human.
Question 2. Coleridge felt that Measure for Measure was the single exception to the delightfulness of Shakespeare's plays. It is a hateful work. Isabella herself contrives to be unamiable, and Claudio is detestable. To what extent do you agree with the comment about Isabella in relation to this scene? Well, without knowing the wider context, we might assume that Coleridge was primarily referring to Isabella's extraordinary language when speaking to Claudio in Act 3, Scene 1, although he might also have been displeased with her readiness to convince Mariana to take her part in Angelo's bed.
In Act 3, Scene 1, when Claudio, terrified of death, tentatively suggests that perhaps Isabella might go ahead and sleep with Angelo in order to save his life, her response seems astonishingly vehement and brutal. There is the set of 3 abusive exclamations which dehumanize and belittle Claudio's all too understandable fear. There is the extraordinary idea that his tentative suggestion that she might go through with Angelo's plan in order to save his life amounts to some kind of incest, as though it almost amounts to sick sexual desire from brother to sister. There is the hope that her mother wasn't faithful to her father and instead was impregnated by another man. For Claudio's character, as revealed in this scene, must clearly show him incapable of being born of their presumably noble father. And finally, there are the crazy imperatives. Take my defiance, die, perish. For someone implicitly calling for a proportionate response from Angelo to Claudio's crime, this is a stunningly disproportionate response to Claudio's beseeching, desperate, all too understandable request. Beyond question, Isabella is contriving to be unamiable in this scene and with this speech. But what about Act 2, Scene 2? Well, the most obvious area to start with is her apparent readiness to give up so soon after being admitted into Angelo's presence. Following just one rebuttal, she almost seems to support the notion of her brother being sentenced to death for his fornication, as shown in the adjective just, and the willingness to use the past tense to describe her relationship with Claudio. But shouldn't we consider the context? Isn't it highly likely that a woman about to become a nun may initially struggle to express herself confidently with men, particularly those as powerful as Angelo? If we believe her lines from Act 1, Scene 4, she wants a life as removed as possible from the world, and so we would expect her to be a little timorous when plunged into a very different male-dominated context. And indeed, when she gets into her stride, Isabella seems far more admirable than unamiable. We talked previously about the extent to which Angelo believes sincerely in the necessity of strict law enforcement, or whether he may be more interested in power for its own sake. Well, Isabella's sincerity in relation to her Christian beliefs surely cannot be questioned. With the lines on screen, she uses her Christian beliefs in the fact that human beings are inherently sinful following the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, before reverently referencing the fact that God might have punished humans further, but instead sent the remedy, the potential cure for human sinfulness in Jesus Christ. Meanwhile, the personification of mercy breathing within Angelo's lips seems beautifully inspired, with the simile referencing the fact that men have the opportunity to be born again when they turn to Christ. So here, Isabella seems earnest and devout, a huge contrast to the majority of other characters we have met so far in the play, who seem far more interested in dirty jokes and dirty daytime practices. It is no wonder that Angelo finds himself falling for her. Some of Isabella's other speeches in this scene seem equally admirable, showing perhaps an unexpected intelligence for someone poised to remove themselves from the world. In this famous speech, recently retweeted by a British newsreader to a black man, resulting in accusations of racism and his resignation, Isabella talks generically about the effect of power and authority on individuals, which in Shakespeare's time would invariably have been men. Such men do not take into account their own spirituality and extraordinarily humble position in relation to God. The simile, like an angry ape, conjures up images of crazed, uncivilized, violent outbursts. Whilst the idea of playing fantastic tricks suggests that these men in authority feel compelled to make ridiculous, grotesque gestures, such as, for instance,
bringing back an archaic rule and sentencing one half of a loving couple pointlessly to death. Those above cannot help but despair at this behaviour. So with this speech, Isabella is pointing to the arrogance of men who misuse their position and power and fail to act proportionately or humbly. This is clearly implicitly aimed at Angelo, although she shows her awareness of the importance of some diplomacy by referring only to the subject generically. This is admirable, brave oratory, worthy of the respect of those on stage, as well as those in the audience and those reading the text at home or in schools. My only quibble in relation to this question is this. Wouldn't Isabella have been even more amiable if she had pointed out that Claudio and Juliet had a formal verbal agreement to marry before deciding to make love?
Unfortunately, we seem to have come to the end of this video, so this has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, imploring you to think a little bit more carefully about Act 2, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. Many thanks for watching.